The iron gates of Blackwater Plantation swung open on a scorching June morning in 1860, revealing what would become a nightmare for the man who thought himself invincible. Master Richard Ashford had a rule. Every new slave purchased at auction had to fight him on their first day. No exceptions, no mercy, no escape. It was his way of establishing dominance, of breaking spirits before they could even settle, of showing everyone on the plantation that resistance was futile. In 12 years, he'd fought 87 men. 87 men had fallen before him. Some lasted 30 seconds, others maybe 2 minutes, but all of them ended the same way: broken, bleeding, and completely subjugated. Richard Ashford was 6 feet 2 and tall, weighed 220 pounds of solid muscle, and had the speed of a man half his age. At 38 years old, he was in his absolute prime, a former bare-knuckle boxer from New Orleans who'd won 23 professional fights before inheriting his father's plantation in 1848. But on June 14, 1860, something walked through those gates that Richard had never encountered before, something that would challenge everything he believed about strength, about power, and about his own invincibility. Before we continue this incredible story of vengeance and justice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment which city you're watching from. Now let's dive into what happened next. Blackwater Plantation sat on 5,200 acres of prime Mississippi Delta land just outside the town of Greenville. The soil was dark and rich, perfect for cotton, and Richard Ashford had turned it into one of the most profitable operations in the entire state. He owned 428 slaves in 1860, making him one of the largest slaveholders in Washington County. The plantation produced 1,800 bales of cotton annually, each bale worth approximately $50, generating nearly $90,000 in revenue each year. It was an empire built on suffering, maintained through terror, and ruled by a man who believed violence was the most effective form of communication. The plantation itself was a monument to wealth extracted from human misery. The main house was a 3-story Greek Revival mansion with white columns, wide verandas, and crystal chandeliers imported from France. The interior featured mahogany furniture, Persian rugs, and oil paintings of Ashford ancestors who'd never done a day's honest work in their lives. The contrast between the opulence of the main house and the squalor of the slave quarters was deliberate, designed to remind everyone of the hierarchy, of who had power and who had nothing. The slave quarters consisted of 40 crude cabins arranged in neat rows behind the main house, far enough away that the screams wouldn't disturb the family's sleep, close enough that overseers could monitor everything. Each cabin housed 10 to 12 people, families crammed together with no privacy, no comfort, no dignity. The cabins had dirt floors, walls that didn't keep out the cold or heat, roofs that leaked when it rained. People slept on wooden pallets with thin blankets, wore clothes made from the cheapest fabric that barely covered their bodies, ate rations of cornmeal, salt pork, and molasses that kept them alive, but never satisfied. Richard Ashford wasn't born cruel. He was trained to be. His father, Thomas Ashford, had been a plantation owner of the old school, brutal when necessary, but primarily focused on profit margins and productivity. Thomas saw slaves as investments, expensive tools that needed to be maintained well enough to produce maximum output. He would whip when workers were slow, sell families apart when debts needed paying, work people until their bodies gave out. But he didn't enjoy the cruelty. It was just business, just the normal operation of a system that everyone in his social class accepted without question. Thomas Ashford had purchased the land in 1823 when Mississippi was still frontier territory, when fortunes could be made by men willing to brutalize others for profit. He'd started with 40 slaves and 800 acres, built it slowly over 25 years into a major operation. He was a pragmatist, understood that dead slaves represented lost capital, that scarred slaves sold for less at auction, that broken slaves couldn't work efficiently. His cruelty had limits, boundaries defined by economic rationality rather than human compassion, but limits nonetheless. Richard was different. As a young man, he'd been sent to New Orleans to learn the cotton trade, to make connections with buyers and shippers, to understand the business side of slavery. His father wanted him to network with merchants, to study market trends, to learn how to negotiate favorable shipping rates. Thomas Ashford imagined his son would return with business acumen and useful contacts, ready to take over the plantation and continue the family legacy. But in New Orleans, Richard discovered something that changed him fundamentally: the fighting pits. In the roughest parts of the city, in warehouses and cellars hidden from police and respectable society, men gathered to watch bare-knuckle boxing matches. These weren't the organized sporting events held in proper venues with rules and referees. These were brutal, illegal fights where men beat each other bloody for money, for glory, for the pure savage joy of dominating another human being. Richard attended his first fight in 1837, brought by some other young men from plantation families who wanted to show the newcomer what real entertainment looked like. He watched two men destroy each other for 45 minutes, watched blood fly and bones break, watched one fighter finally collapse unconscious while the crowd roared approval. Something awakened in Richard that night, some dark attraction to violence that had always been there but had never found proper expression. This wasn't the calculated brutality of plantation management. This was violence as art, as performance, as the ultimate expression of masculine power. He started training the next week, found a former boxer named Jack MacDonald, who ran a gym in the Irish Channel, a rough neighborhood where violence was currency and strength was respected above all else. MacDonald saw potential in Richard, good size, natural athleticism, the kind of aggressive instinct that couldn't be taught. More importantly, Richard had money to pay for training, and MacDonald needed income. For the next 2 years, Richard trained obsessively. He learned how to throw proper punches, how to move his feet, how to read an opponent's body language, and anticipate attacks. He learned how to take a punch, how to fight through pain, how to keep pressing forward when his body screamed at him to quit. He developed iron discipline about his training regimen, waking at dawn to run, spending hours hitting the heavy bag, sparring with anyone willing to step into the ring with him. His first professional fight was in March 1839. He was 21 years old, fighting a dock worker named Tom Sullivan, who had 15 previous fights and a reputation for vicious body punching. The fight lasted 6 rounds, each round lasting until someone went down. Richard won by knockout in the 6th round, stood over Sullivan's unconscious body while the crowd chanted his name, felt a rush of power and satisfaction unlike anything he'd experienced before. He fought professionally from 1839 to 1845, compiled a record of 23 wins and 4 losses, earned a reputation as a vicious fighter who never showed mercy, who kept hitting even after opponents were clearly beaten, who seemed to feed on the pain he inflicted. His losses came early in his career when he was still learning, still making mistakes that more experienced fighters could exploit. But after those first 4 defeats, Richard never lost again. He developed a style based on overwhelming aggression, constant pressure, brutal body punching followed by devastating headshot. He was the kind of fighter other fighters avoided, the kind of opponent that meant guaranteed injury even if you somehow managed to win. The Boxing Commission eventually banned him after he killed a man in the ring in 1845. The opponent was a fighter named James Wright, a tough Irish immigrant who'd won 18 straight fights and was considered one of the best in New Orleans. The match was supposed to be the highlight of the season, a battle between 2 elite fighters. It lasted 11 brutal rounds. In the 11th, Richard hit Wright with a combination that drove him backward into the ropes. Wright bounced forward, and Richard hit him 3 more times in rapid succession. Left hook to the temple. Right cross to the jaw. Left uppercut under the chin. Wright collapsed unconscious before he hit the canvas. He never woke up. Died 3 days later from brain hemorrhaging, his skull fractured in multiple places, blood pooling inside his head until the pressure killed him. Richard showed no remorse when informed of the death, claimed the man was weak, claimed death was the natural consequence of stepping into the ring with a superior fighter, claimed he'd done nothing wrong. The Boxing Commission disagreed, banned Richard permanently, declared him too dangerous to fight legally. Richard was 27 years old, banned from the only activity that had ever made him feel truly alive. He returned to Mississippi in a dark mood, angry at the world, looking for new outlets for the violence that defined him. When Thomas Ashford died in 1848, Richard inherited everything: the plantation, the slaves, the debts, the social position. He was 26 years old, wealthy, powerful, and looking for new ways to exercise the dominance he'd enjoyed in the boxing ring. The plantation gave him the perfect opportunity. Hundreds of people who couldn't fight back, who had no legal protections, who existed entirely at his mercy. It was a fighter's paradise, a place where he could establish absolute dominance without anyone stopping him. But Richard wanted more than just the standard brutality of slavery. He wanted to prove over and over again that he was superior, that he could defeat any man in single combat, that his dominance wasn't just about legal ownership or social position, but about raw physical superiority that would exist regardless of laws or social structures. So he created his ritual. Every new slave would fight him on their first day. The rules were simple, almost sporting in their clarity. Win the fight, earn immediate freedom, lose the fight, learn your place in the hierarchy. Richard announced these rules publicly in front of all his slaves, made sure everyone understood that this was a real opportunity, a genuine path to freedom. Of course, he had no intention of ever losing. The rules existed to make the dominance more complete, more humiliating. It wasn't enough to beat someone who had no choice. Richard wanted his opponents to believe they had a chance, wanted them to try their hardest, wanted to crush their hopes along with their bodies. The fights weren't fair, of course. Richard chose the timing, the location, the rules beyond the basic framework. He was well-fed, well-rested, wearing comfortable clothes and proper shoes. His opponents were usually exhausted from the journey from the auction house, underfed from weeks in the slave pens, wearing chains until moments before the fight began. They were disoriented, terrified, often injured from the rough handling of slave traders who saw them as cargo rather than people. Richard had every advantage, and he exploited all of them without shame or hesitation. The ritual served multiple purposes, each one carefully calculated to maximize Richard's control. First, it broke the new arrivals immediately. They learned on day one that resistance was futile, that the master was physically superior, that their bodies belonged to someone who could hurt them at will. The psychological impact of being beaten in front of hundreds of witnesses, of having your hopes of freedom crushed in your first hour on the plantation was devastating. It established from the beginning that this master was different, more dangerous, more personally invested in demonstrating his dominance. Second, it terrorized the existing slave population. They had to watch these fights, had to witness the beatings, had to see new arrivals broken and bleeding in the dirt. Richard required everyone to attend, made it clear that absence would be punished severely. The assembled crowd had to stand in silence, had to watch every punch, every kick, every moment of suffering. The message was clear. This is what awaits anyone who resists, anyone who slows down, anyone who stops being useful. Your only protection is perfect obedience and constant productivity. Third, it satisfied Richard's psychological need to prove his dominance, to feel the rush of combat, to experience the power of defeating another human being. The plantation work was profitable but boring. Managing overseers, tracking cotton prices, maintaining equipment, all the normal business of running a large agricultural operation. None of it gave Richard the satisfaction he craved, but the fights. The fights made him feel alive again, made him feel like the champion he'd been in New Orleans, gave him regular opportunities to prove his superiority in the most direct way possible. The other plantation owners in the region had mixed feelings about Richard's methods. Some, like William Crawford, who owned the neighboring property, thought it was brilliant psychology, a way to establish control that went beyond the usual whippings and punishments. Crawford had visited several times to watch the fights, had marveled at how effectively they terrorized the slave population, had considered implementing something similar on his own plantation. Others, like Charles Morrison, who owned land to the south, thought it was excessive and economically foolish. Morrison argued that fighting damaged valuable property, that broken bones and concussions reduced productivity, that the same control could be achieved through traditional methods without destroying assets worth thousands of dollars. He'd confronted Richard about it at a dinner party in 1854, argued that 3 men had died in the fights over the years, representing a loss of nearly $4,000 in capital. Richard's response had been simple and chilling. Fear is worth more than $4,000. Charles, 1 dead man teaches 100 others to work harder, to never slow down, to push through pain and sickness, because the alternative is the circle. My productivity is 12% higher than yours. My escape attempts are 1/5 if your rate. My open resistance is basically 0. The dead men are an investment, and the return far exceeds the cost. Morrison had no counter-argument to the numbers. Blackwater Plantation was indeed more profitable, did have fewer problems with resistance, did seem to operate with mechanical efficiency that other plantations couldn't match. The methods were brutal, but they worked. And in the antebellum South, results mattered more than methods. Profit mattered more than humanity. By June 1860, Richard had fought 87 men over 12 years. The fights had become routine, almost boring in their predictability. Some opponents were young and strong, others were older and experienced. A few had clearly known how to fight in their previous lives. None of it mattered. Richard beat them all with casual efficiency. His technique was simple but effective, overwhelming aggression from the first second, targeting the body to slow them down, then finishing with headshot once they were hurt and gasping. He'd broken jaws, shattered ribs, ruptured organs caused permanent disabilities. 3 men had died from injuries sustained in the fights. Deaths that were legally unproatic since slaves weren't considered fully human under Mississippi law since masters had near absolute power over their property. The slave quarters at Blackwater buzzed with whispered stories about the fights, stories passed from the experienced to the newly arrived. Warnings shared in the brief moments of privacy when overseers weren't watching. New arrivals would be warned by the others, told what to expect, advised to just fall down quickly and minimize the damage. Resistance only made it worse, only made Richard angrier, only resulted in more severe beatings. The smart ones would take a few hits, drop to the ground, cover their heads, and endure the kicking until Richard got bored and walked away. That was the survival strategy that the experienced slaves passed down to newcomers, the accumulated wisdom of 12 years of horror. An elderly man named Joseph, who'd been at Blackwater since 1851, would tell new arrivals, "Don't try to win. Can't nobody win. Just try to survive. Go down quick. Cover your head. Let him kick you a few times. If you fight back, he'll break something permanent. If you quit fast, you'll just be sore for a few weeks." I've seen 87 men try and 87 men fail. Learn from them. Survive. But the warning system failed in June 1860 because the man who walked through those gates wasn't like anyone Richard had faced before, and more importantly, wasn't someone who could be warned or advised or convinced to surrender without fighting. The Natchez slave auction was one of the largest in Mississippi, drawing traders from across the Deep South. The auction house was a large wooden building near the river designed specifically for the buying and selling of human beings. On auction days, the building and the yard outside would fill with hundreds of people. Enslaved people waiting to be sold, slave traders managing their inventory, plantation owners looking to purchase new workers, speculators hoping to buy low and sell high, and curious onlookers who came to watch the spectacle. On June 10, 1860, a Tuesday, Richard Ashford attended with $8,000 in credit from the Planters Bank of Natchez, looking to purchase strong field hands for the upcoming harvest season. Cotton prices were high that year. European demand was strong due to the textile boom in England and France, and Richard wanted to increase production to maximize profits. He was specifically looking for men in their 20s, healthy and strong with good teeth and straight backs, the kind of workers who could pick 200 pounds of cotton per day during peak season. The auction yard was brutal theater hell made legal and routine. Nearly 300 enslaved people stood on the block that day, families torn apart with casual cruelty. Children sold away from mothers who screamed and begged and were whipped for their protests. Husbands separated from wives and sent to different states with no hope of ever reuniting. The auctioneer, a fat man named Henry Clarkson, who'd been in the business for 20 years, shouted descriptions and prices while white men examined human beings like livestock, checking teeth for signs of age or disease, feeling muscles to assess strength, making people jump and bend to prove they weren't injured or disabled. Richard examined dozens of people that morning, rejected most for various reasons. Too old, too young, too small. Signs of previous injury, scars that suggested a history of resistance and punishment. He was selective, had the money to be picky, wanted only the best specimens who would give him decades of productive work. He purchased 4 men that day, taking his time with each selection. The first was named Joshua, age 24, sold for $1,200. Joshua had been born in Virginia, raised on a tobacco plantation, sold south when his original master died, and the estate was liquidated. He was strong and healthy, had good teeth and clear eyes, showed no obvious signs of injury or disease. The auctioneer described him as docile and hard-working, code words meaning he'd been broken already, wouldn't cause trouble. The second was Marcus, age 22, sold for $1,350. Marcus had been a field hand in South Carolina, sold because his master needed quick cash to pay gambling debts. He was lean and muscular, moved with the easy confidence of someone young and healthy, would be valuable for years to come. The third was Daniel, age 26, sold for $1 and $400. Daniel had worked on a rice plantation in Georgia, was being sold as part of a lot of 12 men whose master had decided to switch from rice to cotton and wanted field hands with cotton experience instead. He was the most expensive of the 3 because he was older, more experienced, less likely to make costly mistakes. All 3 were unremarkable purchases, exactly the kind of workers Richard bought regularly, young, strong, fitting his requirements perfectly, likely to provide decades of forced labor before their bodies gave out. Richard had made similar purchases dozens of times, knew exactly what to look for, had the process down to a science. But the fourth purchase was different, was unusual, was something Richard bought on impulse without really understanding why. The man's name was listed in the auction catalog as Big Thomas. Age unknown, origin unknown. The lack of information was suspicious, suggested the seller didn't know much about the merchandise, which usually meant the slave had been passed through multiple owners quickly, which usually meant problems. Difficult personality, history of running, health issues, something that made people want to get rid of him fast. Richard almost skipped past the entry entirely, wasn't interested in problem purchases. But then Big Thomas was brought out to the auction block, and everyone stopped and stared. He was massive, the largest human being Richard had ever seen in person. The auctioneer announced his height as 6 feet 8 inches, but he looked even taller, his head towering above everyone around him. His weight wasn't listed, but Richard estimated at least 380 pounds, possibly more. His body was strange, almost grotesque in its proportions, nothing like the lean, muscular builds that plantation owners preferred. His belly was huge, hanging over the rope that served as a belt, straining against the thin shirt they'd given him. His chest was enormous, barrel-shaped, so broad that his arms couldn't hang straight at his sides. His arms themselves were thick as tree trunks, his biceps larger than most men's thighs. His thighs were massive columns of flesh. His calves were huge and solid. For field work. Who would eat enormous for field work? Who would eat enormous amounts of food while producing minimal output? Who would be nothing but a drain on resources? The assembled buyers looked at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to disgust to amusement. A few made jokes about using him to pull a plow like an ox, about how much it would cost to feed him, about whether he'd even fit through a cabin door. The auctioneer seemed embarrassed to present him, clearly didn't expect to get much money. Big Thomas here, strong back, good for heavy lifting and manual labor. Docile temperament, no history of running or resistance. Owner, deceased, estate sale. Need to move him quick. Starting bid at $400. The price was insultingly low, less than half what adult male slaves typically sold for. In 1860, healthy men in their 20s regularly sold for $1,200 to $1,600. Skilled workers like blacksmiths or carpenters could bring $2,000 or more. $400 was what you paid for someone old or sick or disabled or so problematic that they'd be more trouble than they were worth. $400 suggested damaged goods, suggested a terrible investment, suggested the seller just wanted to recoup some small portion of their loss and move on. None of the other buyers bid. They saw what Richard saw, a fat man who would eat enormous amounts of food, who would cost more to maintain than he could possibly produce, who would slow down any work crew, who would be expensive to keep and impossible to resell. It was a losing proposition, obviously bad business, the kind of purchase that only an idiot would make. But Richard kept staring at Big Thomas, kept noticing details that others were missing. The man's hands were huge, easily twice the size of normal hands, fingers thick as sausages, but somehow graceful in their movement. His wrists were thick with what looked like solid muscle, not just fat. His forearms, visible where his sleeves were rolled up, showed definition under the layer of flesh. His calves, visible below his torn pants, were solid and shaped like the calves of someone who'd spent years walking or running. His neck was a column of muscle supporting his massive head, veins visible beneath the skin, suggesting strength rather than just bulk, and his eyes deep set in his round face surrounded by flesh, but clear and intelligent and strangely calm. Most slaves on the auction block showed fear or resignation or despair. Big Thomas showed none of those things. He stood quietly, patiently, his gaze moving slowly across the assembled buyers without apparent emotion. When his eyes met Richard's, there was no submission there, no fear, just calm assessment. He was looking at Richard the same way Richard was looking at him, evaluating, measuring, calculating. Richard felt something stir in his chest, some fighter's instinct that recognized danger, even when the rational mind couldn't explain why this man was dangerous somehow. Richard couldn't articulate how he knew, couldn't point to specific evidence. But every combat instinct he'd developed over years of fighting was sending warning signals. This wasn't some fat, harmless man. This was something else, something hidden beneath the obvious exterior. $800, Richard called out, his voice cutting across the whispered conversations. The other buyers turned to stare at him in shock. Why would Richard Ashford, known for his shrewd business sense, pay $800 for this obvious waste of money? What did he see that they didn't? Richard didn't explain, didn't justify, just stared at the auctioneer and waited. $800 from Mr. Ashford. Anyone else? $800 going once, going twice, sold to Mr. Richard Ashford for $800. The gavel came down. The transaction was complete. Richard now owned Big Thomas along with the other 3 men he'd purchased that day. The slave trader who'd brought Thomas to auction approached Richard afterward, clearly curious about the purchase. Mind if I ask what you're planning to do with him, Mr. Ashford? I've been in this business 20 years, and I've never seen anyone pay that much for someone his size, unless they were planning to use him for show, maybe traveling exhibitions or something. Richard shrugged. I have my reasons. He'll work like everyone else. The trader looked skeptical, but didn't press. Richard's money was as good as anyone's, and if he wanted to waste it on a fat slave, that was his business. What Richard didn't tell the trader, didn't tell anyone, was that he was looking forward to the fight. Big Thomas would be interesting to fight, would be different from the usual opponents, would present a new challenge. Richard imagined it would be like fighting a bear. Slow but powerful, easy to avoid, but dangerous if he managed to land a hit. It would require different tactics, would let Richard demonstrate his superior skill against unusual opposition. The fight would be memorable, would give him a good story to tell. That was worth $800. The journey from Natchez to Blackwater Plantation took 2 days by wagon, traveling on rough dirt roads through Mississippi countryside. The 4 new slaves were chained in the back of a large wagon, their hands and feet shackled to prevent escape attempts. Richard rode alongside on his favorite horse, a black stallion named Caesar, while 2 of his overseers, Marcus Kane and William Tucker, drove the wagon and provided security. The other 3 men, Joshua, Marcus, and Daniel, were terrified. They'd heard stories about different plantations, knew that some masters were crueler than others, had no idea what waited for them at Blackwater. They whispered to each other when they thought the whites couldn't hear, trying to prepare themselves for whatever was coming, trying to find courage in shared fear and mutual support. Joshua spoke quietly. Anyone know anything about this, Master Ashford? Anyone heard stories? Daniel shook his head. Nothing good, I expect. They're never good. Just try to work hard. Keep your head down. Maybe we'll survive. Marcus, the youngest of the 3, was nearly in tears. I heard some masters are worse than others. Heard some will work you to death in a few years. Don't care about keeping you alive long term. Heard some like to hurt people just for fun. Joshua tried to comfort him. Whatever happens, we face it together. We survive together. They can own our bodies, but they don't own what's inside. Remember that. Big Thomas didn't participate in these whispered conversations. He sat quietly in the wagon, his massive body taking up space meant for 3 normal-sized men, his expression calm and distant, his eyes watching the landscape pass by with what seemed like mild interest. The other 3 tried to engage him, tried to ask where he was from, what he knew about plantation work, if he had any advice for surviving whatever was coming. Thomas would just shake his head slightly, wouldn't answer questions, kept his silence. His voice, when he'd spoken briefly at the auction during the examination process, had been surprisingly soft and high-pitched, almost feminine, completely at odds with his massive size. The incongruity was unsettling, added to the sense that there was something strange about this giant man, something that didn't quite fit normal categories. On the first night of the journey, they camped in a clearing off the main road. The slaves were chained to a large tree, given bowls of thin soup and pieces of hard bread, allowed to sleep on the ground. The overseers took turns keeping watch, making sure no one tried to escape, making sure passing travelers didn't try to steal valuable property. Marcus Kane stood watch for the first shift, his rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the darkness. Around midnight, he noticed that Big Thomas was awake, sitting with his back against the tree, staring up at the stars. Kane walked over, curious despite himself. "Can't sleep, boy?" Kane asked. Thomas looked at him with those calm, intelligent eyes. "Just thinking, sir?" His soft voice was barely audible, almost gentle. "Thinking about what?" Kane pressed. Not sure why he was having this conversation, but genuinely curious about this strange slave. "About how things change," Thomas said slowly. "How you can think you know what's coming. Think you understand how the world works. And then something happens that changes everything. Makes you see that the future isn't as fixed as you thought." Kane frowned. This wasn't the kind of talk he expected from a slave. "You some kind of philosopher? You educated or something?" Thomas shook his head. "No, sir, never learned to read. Just think about things sometimes. Notice patterns. Try to understand how the world works." Kane grunted. Well, let me tell you how this world works. We're taking you to Blackwater Plantation where you'll work cotton until your body gives out. That's your future. That's fixed. No amount of philosophizing changes that. Thomas nodded slowly. Yes, sir. That does seem to be the most likely outcome. The way he said it was strange, like he was agreeing with a weather prediction rather than acknowledging his enslavement, like he was remaining open to other possibilities even while accepting the obvious reality. Kane walked away unsettled by the conversation. There was something wrong with this slave, something off about the way he talked and carried himself. Kane made a mental note to watch him carefully, to warn the other overseers that Big Thomas might be troubled despite his docile appearance. On the evening of June 13th, the wagon arrived at Blackwater Plantation. The 4 new slaves were taken to the main yard where all 428 existing slaves had been assembled. This was standard procedure for new arrivals. Richard wanted everyone to witness the welcome ritual, to see the fights, to learn the lesson about resistance being futile and the master being unbeatable. The existing slaves stood in organized rows arranged by work crews, silent and still. They'd been summoned from the fields an hour earlier, told to clean themselves as best they could and present themselves in the main yard. They knew what was coming. Most had seen multiple welcome fights over the years. They knew every detail of the ritual, the challenge issued, the fight that wasn't really a fight. The inevitable defeat, the broken man crawling away while Master Ashford stood victorious. Some of the older slaves, the ones who'd been at Blackwater since the beginning of Richard's ownership, had seen all 87 previous fights. A woman named Sarah, aged 58, who worked in the main house as a cook, had witnessed every single one. She stood near the back of the assembly, her face carefully neutral, her eyes seeing everything. She'd learned long ago not to show emotion during these events, not to give the master the satisfaction of seeing fear or horror or sympathy. She would watch, would remember, would add these new victims to the long list of men she'd seen broken by Richard Ashford's fists. The overseers stood around the perimeter of the yard, 6 of them, all armed with whips and clubs and pistols. Their job was to prevent any slave from interfering, to maintain order, to ensure the ritual proceeded without interruption. They stood relaxed, confident, having done this many times before. They knew how it would end. Richard emerged from the main house dressed in casual clothes, white linen shirt, dark trousers, leather boots polished to a shine. He walked with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a fight on his own property, someone who'd killed 23 men in professional boxing and beaten 87 slaves in these welcome rituals. He was invincible here, was absolute, was godlike in his dominance over these hundreds of people who had no choice but to obey. The plantation bell rang 3 times, the signal that meant stop everything and pay attention. The signal that meant someone was about to suffer for everyone's education. The assembled slaves straightened slightly, their attention focusing on the center of the yard where the fights always took place. Richard surveyed the crowd, let the tension build, enjoyed the power of the moment. 428 people, all completely under his control, all terrified of him, all about to watch him reassert his dominance. This was better than boxing matches in New Orleans. This was purer, more absolute, more satisfying. Finally he spoke, his voice carrying across the silent yard. We have 4 new workers joining us today. As you all know, we have a tradition here at Blackwater. Every new man proves himself on his first day, proves he understands the order of things, proves he knows his place. The rules are simple and fair. Beat me in a fair fight. Walk away free. Lose and you learn who's master here. The speech was familiar, had been given 87 times before with only minor variations. The assembled slaves had heard it dozens of times, knew every word, could probably recite it from memory. Everyone knew what came next. A brief, brutal fight followed by a beaten, broken man crawling away while Richard stood victorious, barely winded, ready for the next challenger. Joshua, step forward. The young man who'd been purchased first walked slowly to the center of the yard. He was trembling slightly, his eyes wide with fear, but he held himself upright. He'd decided during the journey that he would fight back, would try his hardest, would rather be beaten badly while resisting than surrender without trying. The fight lasted less than a minute. Richard moved with professional speed, threw a fast combination that Joshua couldn't defend against. 3 punches to the body, precise and brutal, targeted the solar plexus and liver. Joshua gasped, folded forward, his breath driven from his lungs. When he dropped his hands to protect his body, Richard struck his face with a right hook that had his full weight behind it. Joshua's jaw shattered. His legs gave out. He dropped to the dirt like a puppet with cut strings. Blood poured from his mouth where broken teeth had cut his tongue and cheeks. Richard stood over him for a moment, making sure everyone saw the result, then walked away. 2 slaves were allowed to drag Joshua to the side where he lay semi-conscious, moaning softly, learning that resistance brought only pain. Marcus stepped forward. The 22-year-old tried to be smart about it, tried to use movement and defensive tactics. He'd been in fights before, knew how to duck and slip punches, thought maybe he could tire Richard out or land a lucky shot. He lasted slightly longer than Joshua, maybe 90 seconds, managed to avoid the first few punches, but Richard was faster, more skilled, more experienced. He cut off the ring, limited Marcus's movement, landed a devastating combination to the liver and ribs that made Marcus gasp and fold. The liver shot was perfectly placed, sent nauseating pain through Marcus's entire body, made his legs weak. When his hands dropped to protect his injured torso, Richard struck his face 3 times in rapid succession. Jab, cross, hook. Marcus's nose shattered. Blood exploded across his face. His left eye swelled shut almost instantly. He fell hard, hit the ground face first, lay still. Daniel stepped forward. Daniel was the smart one, had listened to Joseph's advice during the brief time they'd had to talk. He knew resistance was futile, knew the best strategy was to minimize damage. When Richard threw the first punch, Daniel took it, let it hit his shoulder instead of trying to block, and immediately dropped to the ground. He covered his head with his arms, curled into a protective ball, played dead. Richard kicked him a few times in the ribs and back, not hard enough to cause serious injury, just enough to make the point. After about 30 seconds of this, Richard got bored and walked away. Daniel had survived with minimal damage, some bruised ribs, some soreness, his pride intact because he'd never really tried to win, had just tried to survive. Of the 3, he was least injured, would recover fastest, had learned his lesson most efficiently. Then Richard turned to Big Thomas. His eyes lit up with anticipation. This would be interesting, would be different, would give him a real challenge for the first time in months. Big Thomas, step forward. The massive man had been standing quietly to the side during the 3 previous fights, watching with apparent interest, but no visible emotion. When Richard called his name, Thomas walked slowly to the center of the yard. His movement was strange, deliberate, each step carefully placed as if he were thinking about every motion. His massive weight shifted with each stride, his huge body moving with unexpected grace. He looked even bigger standing alone in the center of the yard, looked almost inhuman in his size, looked like something from mythology rather than reality. The assembled slaves stared in fascination, mixed with horror. They'd never seen anyone this large before. Some whispered prayers, asking God to protect this giant man, hoping maybe he could do what no one else had done. Others just watched with resigned sadness, knowing that size wouldn't matter, that Master Ashford would destroy him like he'd destroyed all the others. Sarah, the cook, who'd seen all 87 previous fights, found herself leaning forward slightly, studying Big Thomas with new attention. There was something about the way he moved, something about his calmness that reminded her of things she'd seen long ago in her youth before slavery. Warriors in her village who moved with that same deliberate confidence, who carried themselves like men who knew exactly how dangerous they were. Richard felt his pulse quicken with pre-fight excitement. "You understand the rules, boy?" Big Thomas nodded slowly, his massive head moving with the same deliberate quality as his walk. "You know what happens if you lose?" Another slow nod. "You ready to get beat? Yet?" For the first time, Thomas spoke. His voice was soft, almost gentle, high-pitched in that strange way that seemed wrong coming from such a massive body. "No, Master. I don't think I'm ready for that at all." The response surprised Richard. The tone was wrong, carried none of the submission or fear he expected. It wasn't defiant exactly, wasn't aggressive, but it carried absolute certainty, like someone stating a simple fact rather than expressing an opinion or making a threat. "You think you can beat me?" Richard challenged, a slight smile on his face. This was entertaining already. Thomas considered the question seriously, tilted his massive head slightly as if genuinely thinking about it. "I think we're about to find out, Master. But yes, I believe I can. I believe I will." The honesty of it was shocking. No bravado, no anger, no false confidence, just calm, measured assessment delivered in that soft voice. The assembled slaves gasped. No one had ever spoken to Master Ashford like this. No one had ever shown such confidence without immediately being beaten for their insolence. Richard's smile widened. This was going to be fun. Well then, let's see what you've got, fat man. Let's see if all that weight is muscle or just lard that'll shake when I hit you. He removed his shirt with practiced ease, revealed his fighter's physique to the crowd. His muscles were clearly defined, his chest and arms showed years of training and combat. His body was a weapon honed by discipline and violence. The scars from his boxing career were visible, a thick white line above his left eye where his skin had split repeatedly, marks on his ribs where opponents had landed hard shots, faded bruises that had never quite disappeared. The crowd had seen this 87 times before. They knew what Richard's body represented: dominance, power, the physical superiority that justified his absolute control over their lives. But Big Thomas didn't remove his shirt. He just stood there, hands at his sides, feet planted wide in a stable stance, his enormous body still and calm like a mountain, waiting for the storm. His expression hadn't changed. His soft eyes showed no fear or aggression, just patient readiness. Richard circled him slowly, analyzing his opponent the way he'd been trained decades ago in New Orleans. The man was huge, easily the largest opponent Richard had ever faced. But he was clearly fat, not muscular. That enormous belly was soft tissue hanging over his belt, not hard muscle. Those thick arms probably had some strength, but they'd be slow, would telegraph punches from a mile away. The massive legs would give him a stable base, but no mobility. The sheer size meant terrible cardio. He'd be exhausted within minutes of hard fighting. Richard's strategy formed quickly, based on years of experience. Move fast, stay on the outside, use footwork and speed to avoid his strength, land quick combinations to the body, let the big man tire himself out trying to catch him, then move in for the finish once he was gasping and slow. It was basic boxing tactics adapted for an oversized opponent. This would be like fighting a bull, dangerous if you stood still, easy to defeat if you stayed mobile and smart. Marcus Kane, the head overseer, stepped forward. His job was to start the fight, to drop his hand and signal the beginning of violence. He looked at Richard, got a nod, looked at Big Thomas, who stood motionless and calm. Kane dropped his hand. Fight! Richard exploded forward with professional speed, the same explosive movement that had won him 23 professional boxing matches. He threw a fast jab toward Thomas's face, intending to snap his head back, test his reflexes, establish range and timing. It was a probing punch, fast but not full power, designed to gather information about his opponent's defensive capabilities. But Thomas's hand came up impossibly fast for a man his size, moved with speed that shouldn't exist in a 380-pound body. His massive hand caught Richard's fist in midair, stopped the punch completely like catching a baseball out of the air. Richard felt his entire fist disappear into Thomas's enormous hand, felt thick fingers close around his knuckles, felt pressure beginning to build. Richard tried to pull his hand free, yanked backward with all his strength. Nothing. Thomas's grip was absolute, was immovable, was like having his hand caught in a steel trap. The massive fingers tightened further, and Richard heard something crack. Pain exploded through his hand, sharp and terrible. Thomas was crushing the bones in his fist, was breaking his hand with pure grip strength. Panic flashed through Richard's mind. He threw a desperate left hook at Thomas's ribs, put all his weight behind it, aimed for what he thought would be soft fat over the liver. The punch landed solidly. Richard felt the impact through his entire arm, but it felt like punching a wall covered in padding. The fat was just a layer over something much harder, over solid muscle that didn't yield or give. Thomas didn't even flinch, didn't react at all, just stood there holding Richard's captured right hand, while Richard's best punch did absolutely nothing. Still holding Richard's right hand captive, Thomas pulled him forward sharply, jerking him off balance, destroying his stance and positioning. Richard stumbled forward, completely out of position, defenseless. Then Thomas drove his own right fist into Richard's midsection, a short, powerful punch that traveled maybe 10 inches, but hit with the force of a sledgehammer. Richard's abdominal muscles were well trained, conditioned by years of taking body punches from professional fighters. They offered no protection whatsoever. The punch went through his defense like it wasn't there, drove deep into his core, compressed his internal organs. The air blasted out of his lungs in an explosive gasp. His diaphragm spasmed, refused to work. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but experience pure, overwhelming agony that radiated through his entire torso. Thomas released Richard's crushed hand and stepped back, letting him stagger away. Richard moved backward instinctively, his fighter's training making him create distance. Even though his conscious mind was overwhelmed by pain, he couldn't breathe. His hand was broken. His core felt like it had been hit by a cannonball. His eyes were watering. His vision was blurry. His body was screaming at him that this was wrong, that he was in serious danger. The watching slaves were absolutely silent. This wasn't following the script. The master was hurt. Really hurt after just 2 exchanges. In 12 years, in 88 fights, including this one, they'd never seen Master Ashford take real damage. Had never seen him stagger, never seen him hurt, never seen him look anything but completely dominant. Richard looked up at Thomas through watering eyes, saw the massive man standing exactly where he'd started, hands back at his sides, expression unchanged, patient and calm, like someone waiting at a bus stop rather than engaged in brutal combat. "You're fast," Thomas said in that soft, incongruous voice. "Very well trained. I can see the professional technique, but you're not strong enough, Master. Not for this. Not for me." Richard wanted to respond, wanted to curse or threaten, wanted to say something that would restore his dominance, but his lungs wouldn't work properly. His broken hand throbbed with every heartbeat. His entire core felt crushed. He'd been hit before during his boxing career, had taken hard punches from men who knew how to fight, but nothing had ever felt like that body shot. It was like being kicked by a mule. He forced himself upright, forced air into his spasming diaphragm, assessed the situation with the tactical mind he developed over years of combat. Direct assault wasn't working. The man was too strong, too solid, had reflexes that shouldn't exist in a body that size, had punching power that was genuinely terrifying. New strategy: use footwork, stay mobile, throw combinations from angles, accumulate damage over time, avoid the clinch at all costs. Even a giant would fall eventually if you hit him enough times in the right places. Richard circled left, threw a low kick at Thomas's lead knee, trying to compromise his mobility. Didn't shift his weight, didn't show any. Didn't shift his weight, didn't show any sign of pain. He just tracked Richard's movement with those calm, intelligent eyes, rotating slowly to keep facing him. Richard circled right, switched directions, threw 3 quick punches with his left hand since his right was broken and useless, jabbed to the face, crossed to the jaw, hooked to the temple. Fast professional combinations designed to snap the head back to cause disorientation and damage. Thomas blocked the first 2 with minimal arm movements, barely shifting his massive forearms to deflect the strikes. He slipped the third by moving his head just slightly, maybe 3 inches, just enough that the hook whistled past his ear instead of connecting. His defensive movement was minimal, but perfectly efficient. He wasn't wasting energy on big dramatic blocks or dodges. He was doing exactly what was necessary and nothing more, conserving his energy, staying calm and controlled. Richard recognized the signs of genuine training of someone who'd learned to fight from someone skilled, who understood defensive fundamentals at a deep level. Then Thomas attacked. He moved forward with shocking speed for his size, closed the 5 feet of distance Richard had created in what seemed like one massive stride. Suddenly, his huge hands were on Richard's shoulders, fingers like steel cables wrapping around muscle and bone. Before Richard could react, before he could escape or counter or do anything, Thomas lifted him. Richard found himself being raised off the ground, his 220 pounds of muscle and bone being lifted like he weighed nothing. The sensation was terrifying, completely alien to anything he'd experienced before. In boxing matches, in street fights, in 87 welcome fights, Richard had always been the strong one, the one in control. Now he was being manhandled like a child, lifted completely off the ground by someone who was casually demonstrating strength that Richard couldn't even comprehend. Thomas held him there for a long moment, arms locked straight. Richard suspended 7 feet above the ground with his feet kicking uselessly in the air. The message was crystal clear. You are powerless. All your training, all your victories, all your dominance means nothing against my strength. You are a child in my hands. Then Thomas threw him. Not dropped him, not let him fall, but actively hurled him backward through the air like throwing a sack of grain. Richard flew, traveled maybe 8 feet horizontally, had time to feel genuine terror before he hit the ground hard enough to knock him senseless. Dust exploded around his body. He rolled twice from the momentum, ended up face down in the dirt, every bone in his body screaming, his mind trying to process what had just happened. The watching crowd gasped collectively, a sound of shock and disbelief that rippled through the assembled slaves. In 12 years of welcome fights in 87 previous battles, they had never seen Master Ashford on the ground, had never seen him hurt, had never seen him lose control of a fight. The psychological impact was enormous, was revolutionary. If the master could be thrown through the air like a child, what did that mean about his power? What did that mean about the entire system built on his physical dominance and invincibility? Sarah, watching from the back, felt tears spring to her eyes. She'd seen 87 men broken in this yard, had watched them beaten, humiliated, destroyed, had added their suffering to the weight of horror she carried in her heart. But now, for the first time, she was watching something different, was watching the master get beaten, was watching impossible vengeance unfold before her eyes. Richard pushed himself up on his elbows, spat blood and dirt from his mouth, tried to process what was happening. His right hand was broken, multiple bones shattered. His ribs felt cracked on both sides from the initial body shot. His back was screaming from the impact of being thrown. He'd been in the fight maybe 3 minutes and was already more damaged than he'd been in any professional boxing match, including the ones he'd lost. This wasn't possible. This fat slave wasn't supposed to be able to do this. Nothing about Thomas's appearance suggested this level of speed, power, or skill. He looked like someone who'd be slow and clumsy, someone Richard could pick apart with superior technique and conditioning. But the reality was completely different from the appearance. Big Thomas was doing this, was beating him, was standing calmly in the center of the yard, waiting for Richard to get up, showing no signs of fatigue or damage, just patient readiness. And Richard realized with creeping horror that Thomas wasn't even fighting at full capacity, was holding back, was being careful not to kill him. Not because Thomas feared consequences, but because Thomas had complete control over the situation and could choose exactly how much damage to inflict. Pride wouldn't let Richard quit, wouldn't let him surrender in front of his slaves, in front of his overseers, in front of everyone who'd watched him dominate for 12 years. He climbed to his feet slowly, swayed slightly from pain and disorientation, forced himself steady through pure willpower. He charged forward desperately, threw wild haymakers with his left hand, abandoned all technique and strategy in favor of pure aggression. Maybe if he could land something solid, maybe if he could hurt Thomas even a little, maybe he could turn this around. The punches were wide and telegraphed, thrown by a man who'd abandoned his training in panic. Thomas blocked everything easily. His massive arms moved with precision, deflecting punches that should have been too fast for someone his size to see or react to. Richard might as well have been moving in slow motion for all the trouble Thomas had defending against the attacks. Then Thomas caught Richard's left wrist in mid-punch, stopped his arm completely, and pulled him into a clinch. Those enormous arms wrapped around Richard's torso, and Thomas began to squeeze. Richard felt his ribs compress, felt his spine flex backward, felt pressure building to unbearable levels. He couldn't breathe, couldn't expand his chest against the crushing force. His arms were pinned to his sides, completely immobilized. Thomas was bear-hugging him, using his massive strength and weight to crush Richard's body with pure mechanical pressure. This was how bears killed hunters in the wilderness, how anacondas killed prey. Pure crushing force that broke bones and ruptured organs and squeezed the life out of struggling victims. Richard panicked completely. All his training, all his experience, all his victories meant nothing in this moment. He threw his head backward violently, tried to headbutt Thomas's face, the last desperate move of a man with no other options. His skull connected solidly with Thomas's nose. Richard felt the impact, heard something crunch, but Thomas just grunted slightly, didn't loosen his grip, kept squeezing. The headbutt had done nothing except maybe broken Thomas's nose, and even that didn't make him release the hold. Richard felt his ribs beginning to crack, felt something give way in his chest, felt sharp pain that meant internal damage. He was seconds from permanent injury or death, from having his rib cage crushed and his organs ruptured. He did the only thing he could do. He screamed, not a battle cry, not a curse, but a high-pitched, desperate shriek of submission and terror. "Stop! Please, I give up. You win. Please stop." Thomas released him immediately. The moment Richard submitted, the pressure disappeared. The arms opened and Richard collapsed to the ground like a puppet with cut strings. He lay there gasping, crying, broken in body and spirit. His ribs were fractured, his hand was crushed, his back was injured, his face was covered in blood and dirt and tears. He'd been utterly dominated, completely destroyed, beaten so thoroughly that there was no room for excuses or explanations or face-saving lies. He'd lost. For the first time in 88 fights spanning 12 years, Richard Ashford had lost. Big Thomas stood over him, breathing normally, not even sweating despite the exertion of fighting and lifting and throwing. He looked down at Richard with an expression that might have been pity, might have been contempt, might have been nothing at all. Then he spoke, and every slave in the yard heard him clearly, heard words that would echo through the plantation for years to come. You said the rules were simple, master. You said, beat you in a fair fight, walk away free. Those were your exact words spoken in front of all these witnesses. I beat you. So according to your own rules, your own promise, I'll be leaving now. I'll be walking out of here a free man. The audacity was stunning, was revolutionary, was completely outside normal social rules. No slave ever demanded freedom. No slave ever presumed to hold a white man to his word, as if contracts and promises applied to them. No slave ever acted like they had rights or standing to make claims. But Thomas's tone suggested he genuinely expected Richard to honor the deal, genuinely believed that rules meant something, that words had power even when spoken by masters to slaves. Richard tried to speak, opened his mouth, managed only a wheeze. His broken ribs made talking agony, made breathing difficult. Marcus Kane stepped forward, his hand moving to the pistol at his belt. His face was red with anger and shock. You're not going anywhere, boy. You just assaulted your owner. That's a hanging offense in Mississippi. We'll string you up right here, right now, and make it slow so everyone learns what happens when you raise your hand against a white man. Thomas turned those calm eyes to Kane, looked at him without fear or submission. Master Ashford made an offer in front of witnesses. He said, beat him in a fair fight, earn freedom. Those were his exact words, spoken 88 times over 12 years to every new man who came to this plantation. I beat him according to the rules he himself established. The deal is complete. I won my freedom fairly. His logic was impeccable. His tone was reasonable. But the entire premise was insane from the perspective of slave society. Slaves didn't have contracts with masters. Promises made to slaves weren't legally binding. The legal system of Mississippi didn't recognize enslaved people as parties to agreements. A slave had no more right to hold a master to his word than a horse or a plow had such rights. But something strange was happening in the yard. The 428 assembled slaves were watching with an intensity that terrified the 6 overseers. This wasn't the usual resigned misery, the dead-eyed acceptance of horror that the overseers were used to seeing. This was focused attention. Was possibility dawning in hundreds of minds simultaneously? Was hope emerging from the despair that normally defined plantation life? If Big Thomas could beat Master Ashford, if he could demand freedom and stand there calmly making his case while the master lay broken in the dirt, then maybe the entire system wasn't as solid as it appeared. Maybe resistance was possible. Maybe individual strength and courage could overcome institutional power. Maybe things could change. Kane drew his pistol, pointed it at Thomas's massive chest. The gun looked tiny in comparison to Thomas's bulk, like a toy being pointed at a mountain. Last chance. Get on your knees right now and beg Master Ashford for mercy, or I'll shoot you dead right here in this yard and leave your body for the dogs. Thomas looked at the pistol, looked at Kane's face, and didn't move, didn't drop to his knees, didn't show fear, didn't plead. His calmness was unnerving, was wrong, suggested he genuinely didn't fear death or pain or anything the whites could threaten him with. He'd already won what he came for. Death might come, but he'd beaten the man who thought himself invincible, had proven that the system could be defeated. That was worth dying for. The yard was absolutely silent. 428 slaves held their breath, waiting to see if Kane would pull the trigger, if Big Thomas would die for his victory. If this brief moment of impossible triumph would end in the usual way with black blood soaking into Mississippi dirt. That's when Richard, still on the ground, broken and bleeding, managed to speak. Stop. His voice was weak, barely audible, each word costing him agony from his broken ribs. But it carried command, the authority of a man who was still the legal owner of this plantation, even if he'd just been beaten in front of everyone. Kane hesitated, kept the pistol trained on Thomas, but didn't fire. Sir, Richard continued, forcing out words through pain. He's right. I made a promise. Everyone here heard it. I've said it 88 times over 12 years, the same words every time. Beat me, walk free. Those were my terms. But sir, Kane protested, you can't seriously be considering freeing him. He beat you. If you let him walk away, every slave on this plantation will think they can resist. The whole system collapses. they'll stop fearing you. Richard knew Kane was absolutely right, knew that freeing Thomas would undermine everything, would destroy the psychological foundation of his control. But he also knew something else, something fundamental about how power actually worked. His entire authority didn't rest just on violence. It rested on being a man of his word, on being predictably brutal but fair within his own twisted rules, on maintaining an internal consistency that made him different from the chaos of arbitrary cruelty. For 12 years, he'd made the same promise. For 12 years, he'd won every fight, so the promise had cost him nothing. It had been a safe bet, a way to make his dominance seem almost sporting, to give his victims hope before crushing it. But now he'd lost, and honoring his word would cost him one valuable slave worth $800. Breaking his word would cost him something worse: his credibility, his reputation as a man who kept his promises, the foundation of his authority. "Cut his chains," Richard ordered, the words tasting like poison even as he said them. "Give him manumission papers. He beat me fair according to the rules I established. He's free." Kane looked like he wanted to argue further, wanted to press the point, wanted to convince Richard that this was a catastrophic mistake. But the look in Richard's eyes stopped him. This wasn't negotiable. The master had made his decision. Within an hour, documents were prepared. The plantation had a standard form for manumission, rarely used but available. Richard signed it with his left hand since his right was broken and useless. His signature shaky from pain but legally valid. The document declared that the Negro man known as Big Thomas, approximately 30 years of age, is hereby manumitted and freed from slavery, owing no further service to Richard Ashford or any other person. Big Thomas walked out of Blackwater Plantation that evening. A free man, he carried papers signed and witnessed, declaring him legally free under Mississippi law. The papers wouldn't protect him perfectly. Mississippi's laws about free blacks were oppressive and complicated, but they were better than nothing. They were a shield, thin and fragile, but real enough to matter. As Thomas walked through the plantation gates for the last time, he looked back once at the assembled slaves who were still standing in the yard, still processing what they'd witnessed. Hundreds of eyes watched him leave, watched impossible freedom achieved through strength and courage, watched the master forced to keep his word, even in humiliating defeat. Thomas nodded once, a small gesture of acknowledgement and solidarity. Then he turned and walked away into the Mississippi evening, heading north toward the river, toward freedom, toward a future that was uncertain but his own. He never looked back again. The story of what happened at Blackwater Plantation on June 14, 1860, spread through the slave communities of Mississippi like wildfire, carried by the invisible networks of communication that white people never fully understood or could control. Within days, every plantation in Washington County knew. Within weeks, slaves across the entire state were telling the story. Within months, the legend had reached Tennessee, Alabama, Louisiana, Arkansas. The details varied in the retellings, growing and changing, like all oral traditions. Some versions said Thomas had thrown Master Ashford 50 feet through the air. Some said he'd broken both of Ashford's arms and legs. Some said he'd made the master cry and beg for mercy in front of everyone. The exaggerations didn't matter, didn't diminish the power of the core truth. A slave had beaten his master in single combat. The master had been forced to honor his word and grant freedom. The system could be defeated. Masters weren't invincible. Resistance was possible. The story served purposes beyond simple entertainment or information sharing. It was a counter-narrative to the ideology of white supremacy that justified the entire system of slavery. It challenged the claim that black people were naturally inferior, naturally weak, naturally suited for bondage. If a slave could defeat his master in direct physical combat, what did that say about the supposed natural hierarchy? What did that say about the claims that whites were superior and blacks needed to be controlled? For the enslaved people who heard the story, it provided something precious and rare: hope. Not naive hope that freedom would come easily, or that masters would suddenly become kind, but hope that resistance could succeed, that individual courage and strength could matter, that the system wasn't as permanent and unbreakable as it appeared. For Richard Ashford, the consequences were immediate and devastating. Other plantation owners in the region confronted him at the next county social gathering, demanded to know why he'd freed such a dangerous man, why he'd set such a catastrophic precedent, why he'd undermined the entire system by showing that masters could be beaten and forced to keep their promises to slaves. Richard's answer was consistent. "I gave my word as a gentleman. A man who breaks his word is no man at all. regardless of who that word was given to. I will not become a liar to maintain control. Some plantation owners respected the position even if they disagreed with the decision. They understood that honor and reputation mattered in their social class, that being known as a man of your word had value that transcended individual financial losses. Others thought Richard had gone soft, had lost his edge, had made a catastrophic mistake that would inspire resistance across the entire region. The welcome fights ended that day, killed by Richard's humiliating defeat. He never held another one, never called out new arrivals to fight him, never tried to reassert his dominance through ritualized combat. The tradition died with his loss, became a memory rather than an ongoing practice. Richard Ashford continued to own and operate Blackwater Plantation, still controlled 427 slaves, still made enormous profits from cotton production. But something fundamental had changed in the power dynamics. The slaves weren't as terrified anymore, weren't as broken, weren't as convinced of his invincibility. They'd seen him bleed, seen him cry, seen him beaten and humiliated. The mythology of untouchable dominance was shattered forever. His physical injuries took months to heal. His crushed right hand never fully recovered, leaving him with reduced grip strength and chronic pain for the rest of his life. The fingers didn't close properly, made it difficult to hold tools or weapons. His fractured ribs healed crooked, gave him breathing problems and constant discomfort that worsened as he aged. His back injury left him with persistent pain that made riding horses difficult, that kept him awake at night, that required increasing amounts of ludum to manage. But the physical damage was trivial compared to the psychological wound. He'd been beaten, humiliated, forced to submit in front of everyone who feared him. The memory haunted him, invaded his sleep, turned him bitter and paranoid. He became suspicious of every large slave on his plantation, would study them with fearful eyes, would sometimes order them sold away just because their size reminded him of Big Thomas. His social standing declined over the following months and years. Other plantation owners began to see him as weak, as someone who'd let a slave get the better of him, as someone who'd made a choice that prioritized personal honor over the collective interests of the slave-owning class. Invitations to social events decreased. Business partnerships became harder to arrange. His opinions carried less weight in county politics. As for Big Thomas, his trail becomes harder to follow after he walked through those plantation gates. The historical record shows a manumission document filed in Washington County, Mississippi in June 1864. Thomas Negro man, very large stature, freed by R. Ashford of Blackwater Plantation. The document exists in the county archives, has been examined by historians, confirms that the basic facts of the story are true. After that official document, Thomas disappears from formal records for almost a year. Free blacks in the antebellum South lived precarious existences subject to laws that restricted their movement, required them to have white sponsors, made them vulnerable to being kidnapped and re-enslaved. Many chose to leave the South entirely, heading north to states where free blacks had marginally better legal protections, where the risk of being captured and sold back into slavery was lower. The most detailed account of Thomas's movements comes from a diary kept by a Quaker abolitionist named Elizabeth Morrison, who lived in southern Indiana near the town of Madison. The Morrison family were known conductors on the Underground Railroad, their farm serving as a station where escaped slaves could rest, get food and medical care, and receive help continuing north to Canada or to free states. In an entry dated March 12, 1861, Elizabeth Morrison wrote, "Today we sheltered the most remarkable man I have ever encountered. He arrived at our door near midnight carrying papers declaring him a free man, manumitted in Mississippi. He calls himself Thomas Freeman, having taken the surname to match his status. He stands nearly 7 feet tall and weighs perhaps 400 pounds, a giant of a man with gentle manners and a surprisingly soft voice. Despite his enormous size, Thomas moves with unexpected grace and speaks with careful intelligence. His story is extraordinary, almost beyond belief. He claims he won his freedom in Mississippi through single combat with his master, defeating him in a fight witnessed by hundreds of people. The master, bound by his own publicly stated rules, was forced to grant manumission. I had difficulty believing such a tale until Thomas showed me his papers, properly signed and witnessed, clearly legitimate documents. He also showed me scars on his back and arms, testimony to years of brutal treatment. Whatever his past, he has clearly suffered greatly. Thomas is traveling north to Canada, fearing that the current political turmoil will make even legal freedom unsafe in the United States. He speaks of the growing tensions between North and South, believes war is coming, fears that in the chaos his freedom papers might not be respected. He carries with him detailed knowledge of plantation operations, locations of slave quarters, patrol patterns, the kinds of information that could help others escape. He has offered to work with our network to help guide others to freedom, to use his strength and knowledge in service of the cause. I pray God protects this brave soul. He represents everything the slave power fears: intelligence, strength, courage, and the living proof that their claims of superiority are lies. If war comes, men like Thomas Freeman will be invaluable to the cause of liberty. If this account refers to our Big Thomas, and the details strongly suggest it does, then he survived at least until March 1861 and was working with the Underground Railroad. Whether he made it safely to Canada, whether he helped others escape, whether he lived to see slavery's end in 1865, the historical record doesn't tell us. What we do know is the impact of his victory. The story spread throughout slave communities across the South, became legend, became myth, became proof that the system could be beaten. It inspired resistance in forms both large and small. Some slaves who heard the story found courage to attempt escape. Others used it to maintain hope during the darkest times. Still others simply took comfort in knowing that at least once a slave had beaten his master and walked away free. When the Civil War began in April 1861, just 10 months after Thomas's victory, Richard Ashford initially supported the Confederate cause with enthusiasm. He contributed $10,000 to equip a local regiment, sent 4 of his overseers to fight, gave speeches at rallies about defending Southern rights and Southern honor. But as the war dragged on, as Union forces began occupying parts of Mississippi, as the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in January 1863, Richard saw the writing on the wall. His world was ending. His wealth was evaporating. His power was disappearing into the chaos of total war. In March 1865, with Union troops approaching Greenville and slavery obviously doomed, Richard Ashford made a final gesture of spite and rage. He burned Blackwater Plantation to the ground, set fire to the main house with its Greek Revival columns and crystal chandeliers, burned the slave quarters, the cotton gins, the barns, everything he'd built over 17 years of ownership. He couldn't bear the thought of freed slaves living in his house, working his land as free laborers, erasing everything he'd created. Then he fled west to Texas, hoping to preserve some fragment of the Confederate cause in the borderlands, hoping to continue slavery somehow, even as it collapsed everywhere else. Richard Ashford died in San Antonio, Texas in 1873 at age 51. He never rebuilt his wealth, never regained his social status, lived his final years in frustration and rage. His obituary in the San Antonio Express was exactly 2 sentences. Richard Ashford, formerly of Mississippi, died Tuesday of heart failure. No services planned. The slaves of Blackwater Plantation were freed when Union forces occupied Washington County in June 1865. Most stayed in the region, working as sharecroppers on land they'd once been enslaved on. It was an improvement over slavery, but far from true freedom, still a system of exploitation that kept them poor and dependent, but they were free legally and actually. The system that had owned them was destroyed by war and politics and the accumulated resistance of millions of enslaved people who'd never stopped fighting for liberty. The story of Big Thomas became folklore in black communities across the South. It was told at gatherings passed from grandparents to grandchildren, preserved in oral tradition even when written records were scarce. The details changed with each telling, but the core remained the same. A slave had fought his master and won freedom through strength and courage. In 1935, during the Federal Writers Project, formerly enslaved people were interviewed about their experiences. An elderly woman named Clara R. Johnson, age 87, who'd been enslaved on a plantation neighboring Blackwater, told this story to her interviewer. "I was just a girl, maybe 12 years old when it happened. We all knew about Master Ashford and his fighting ritual. Everyone in the county knew. He never lost. Not in 12 years, not once. Then one day, he bought this enormous man from Natchez, biggest person anyone had ever seen. That man beat Master Ashford so badly, they said he was never the same after. Made him keep his promise and walk away free. I didn't see it myself, but everyone talked about it for years. It gave us hope, showed us the masters weren't gods, weren't unbeatable, just men who could bleed and lose like anyone else. When I heard that story as a girl, I started believing maybe someday we'd all be free. And we were eventually took a war, but we made it." The story of Big Thomas serves as a powerful counter-narrative to the myths created during and after slavery. For generations, white historians portrayed slavery as a relatively benign institution where enslaved people were generally content with their status, where resistance was rare, where the system ended primarily due to Northern intervention rather than the constant struggle of enslaved people themselves. Stories like Thomas's challenge that mythology directly. They prove that enslaved people resisted constantly in every way available to them. They proved that the image of the passive accepting slave was a comforting lie told by people who needed to believe their cruelty was justified and accepted. The truth was always more complex and more heroic. The truth was that people like Big Thomas existed throughout the history of American slavery. Individuals who refused to accept their assigned role, who fought back when opportunity arose, who achieved freedom through courage and strength and intelligence. Today, there is no historical marker commemorating Big Thomas or Blackwater Plantation. If you drive through Washington County, Mississippi, you'll find farmland where the plantation once stood, soybeans and cotton still growing in that rich delta soil. The buildings are gone, burned in 1865, never rebuilt. The people who lived and suffered and sometimes triumphed. They are mostly forgotten. Their names erased from official histories, their stories preserved only in fragments of oral tradition and scattered documents. But the story survives because it matters, because it challenges comfortable lies about the past, because it proves that resistance was always possible, that oppression was never willingly accepted, that human dignity persisted even in the most brutal circumstances. What do you think of Big Thomas's story? Was Richard Ashford right to honor his word despite the cost? Should Thomas have stayed to help free others, or was escape the only rational choice? How do we balance the inspiration of individual resistance against the collective suffering it sometimes caused? These questions don't have easy answers. The moral landscape of slavery was complicated by the fundamental injustice of the system itself. Every choice was impossible. Every decision carried terrible costs. But what's undeniable is that Big Thomas refused to accept his assigned fate. He saw an opportunity in Richard Ashford's arrogant ritual, prepared himself physically and mentally, executed his plan perfectly, and achieved the seemingly impossible. Freedom won through direct combat with his owner. His story reminds us that history is full of moments when someone refused to accept injustice, when someone stood up despite overwhelming odds, when someone fought back and won. Those moments matter. They inspire. They prove that change is possible even when it seems impossible. If you found this story powerful, subscribe to the channel and share it with others who need to understand that resistance takes many forms. That courage isn't always loud or obvious, that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when their moment comes. Until next time, remember the powerful aren't as invincible as they want you to believe. Systems of oppression aren't as permanent as they seem. Individual courage can spark collective change. Be that person when your moment arrives. Until next video.